Right, so this talk, it's more of a reflective story really about the experience of adopting a mandated tool chain and what this created in practice, and some observations on why standardisation doesn't automatically give you a platform. It's often not about if the tools work, it's more about what they hide, and the real issue is often underneath those tools. But first, it's louder. First, a little bit about me. I'm Andy Blagnys. I work for Axiologik. I'm an architect there. I've been there about 4 years. Previous to that, I spent 15 years in telecoms, channeling my inner angry, grumpy, opinionated engineer into hopefully a more worldly, pragmatic architect. My sweet spot at the moment is turning perfect on paper, target state, best practice strategies into something that might actually survive contact with the real world, which is kind of a theme that goes throughout this presentation. So let's set the scene. So Axiologik were brought into a large global financial organisation, initially to help them with their data centre closure program. So they were having to move all of their apps, their data centre apps, to the cloud. So we were brought in to be able to start, making those a bit more cloud native and migrate those over. But then group started a bit of strategic initiative to kind of standardise and centrally govern some things, and very quickly they targeted all of the CI/CD pipelines globally. So they said we're all going to standardise on this one tool chain that we're going to deliver you. So we were, I can see some grimaces. We got mandated this tool chain. But, on the face of it, what was promised, it all made sense. So it was, to standardise, centrally govern, and share that technology. On paper, that's not really controversial. Within the whole global organisation, there were a lot of scars, though, from that kind of transformation before, because everyone admitted it was all very painful, these kind of things, very slow and very political, and didn't really deliver what it initially set out with. So there was a lot of scepticism, but everyone did actually agree that the change was necessary. It was a good idea, but no one believed that it would be pain-free and actually deliver what was promised. So, onto what was promised. The best-in-class delivery platform. We had standardised tool chains across all of the stacks, so your IaaS and your PaaS, they all had their standard tool chains, say within PaaS, your Java, your .NET, your Angular, they all had some great Helm templates to try and do the heavy lifting for you, and that's awesome. Infrastructure as code baked in right from the start. That sounds lovely. In such a highly regulated environment, governance and guardrails by design, that would really remove a lot of the headaches for us as well. Granular access control, so we were able to ensure that we had the division of responsibility between non-prod and prod. Yeah, this is all sounding good so far, right? Artifacts management and traceability, and a lot of new cool security tools. We had consistent deployment strategies, so we were very interested in this because previously in our pipelines we were delivering products into the cloud by orchestrating every single microservice pipeline itself. So you were executing and delivering 20 pipelines into the cloud, manually orchestrating this change set up for us the ability to have a kind of umbrella. So you defined your product in Helm with all of the versions of the artifacts that were going, and with a push button deploy, you deployed your product. That sounded great. So you've got all of the observability hooks, they're going to automate all of the testing, and there's going to be some very empowering self-service onboarding, so you can be able to set up your own products there. onboard your users, create your pipelines, all great, right? But what started to emerge was a gap between a technically sound platform and something that teams could actually use at scale. So we often assume that with better standardised compliance system, adoption naturally follows. But engineering teams, they don't really consume those architecture diagrams. They more experience friction through delivery pressure, through onboarding pain and loss of autonomy and migration stress. So I think you can see where this is going. So this is what happened. So there wasn't a catastrophic sudden failure. It just eroded over time quite gradually. And looking back, there was 3 distinct periods here. So first of all, the first phase was the POC honeymoon. So all of the suitable apps were chosen. We've got some very apt apps, some great teams, very motivated, very experienced, and crucially, all of the component owners, all of those owners of those parts of the tool chains, they were in hypercare, very, very keen to prove that their product was performant and well designed. And guess what? It worked. There were some gaps, but this was a POC, and kind of been a bit pragmatic. We said, yeah, that's normal, that's okay. We'll have that delivered in version 2 of the roadmap. That's all right. So at this stage, the volume was very low, and so you couldn't really see those cracks appearing. So we moved on to migration at scale. Had more teams onboarded. This is when the legacy apps came on, some of the edge cases, and you guessed it, this is where some of the workarounds began to appear. Moving on from there, we got to operational reality, where we started using this platform and experiencing the pain, daily from it, and that's where the confidence erodes. The trust disappears very quickly. It disappears far faster than capability improves. So here we start noticing some of the initially missing glue. So observability of the tool chain, that was still on the roadmap, believe it or not. So we couldn't actually see what was happening between all of these components. There's testing strategy gaps. We had unit testing, but the guys who put all of this together, they hadn't actually engaged with the test COE, probably in a different country, So they were looking at Octane, the test COE. They were looking at all kinds of, Selenium, Postman, all that good stuff you want in your pipeline. But that wasn't included. That was coming later. There was a lot of security theatre as well, those cool new security tools. So one of them, for example, we had Fortify brought in, and that identified loads of violations. We fixed some great violations there, but there was no waiver process. So we couldn't waiver all of those red herrings there. So guess what happened? Everyone disabled the security gates on the pipeline. Had some RBAC misalignment, so people were getting majorly over-provisioned. For example, a security champion, in order to do their job, they needed the developer permission, but in order to do their job properly, they needed the manager permission, which allowed them to admin all of the users, change the roles. And I don't need to go into why that's best practice. Why that's not best practice. And we had partial infrastructure as code. So that infrastructure as code we were promised, halfway through we started to get it. So we could deploy our environments through a pipeline. That was great. But those Terraforms weren't chained onto the deployments. So you stopped when you delivered your environment, and you had to manually alter your deployment with the new namespace, and that slowed things down, introduced drift and the errors that you can imagine inherent there. So then they're the kind of like the foundations that really should have been there at the start, aren't they, those bits? But they caused something much deeper, and also there were some additional things that really, really hurt our delivery. So poor reliability and availability. There was no observability to prove this. The published SLA was 99.9 uptime. We had no observability, so we couldn't prove it, but we did start recording, outages and, using the GitLab API to retrieve all of our tool chains, see what failed. We produced our own observability a little bit to be able to have those metrics to promote some decent discussion. The whole platform was highly composable. Every single one of those, that second slide I showed with all of the promised parts of the tool chain, they were all owned by separate teams. There's a security specialism, there was the testing specialism, and they all acted in their own little world. They didn't really talk to each other, which caused a lot of that coupled with poor reliability and availability and lack of observability really caused some black box dependencies to hit us hard. A lot of you were raising JIRA tickets and going through cross-team escalations to try and get anything resolved or debugged. And the change impact connect, those guys acting in their own little worlds. They tested their change locally, but it failed. It failed through actual, us exercising the platform after they'd made the change. So the human impact, what this caused in reality, and this became obvious that this was not just a purely technical problem. We inherited a transformation problem. So workarounds, where engineers weren't being awkward, they were working around stuff because that's what they do, right? They optimize for delivery. And when the official path is painful, they route around it. That kind of platform reputation spreads fast and teams arrive expecting failure. And that creates a very difficult dynamic because all of those initial skeptics that were there, they felt very validated. And teams needed to upskill. But when you're facing that kind of hard-to-use, painful platform, that really kills motivation. So when you're trying to upskill into all of the cloud-native tech, there just isn't the motivation to do it because you're feeling such pain. And the final gap was probably one of the big killers. There was no operating model for those guys. All those composable teams. There was nothing, helping them to form a cohesive ecosystem at all. And also there was no real published ways of working. I don't think it should have been a granular, declared way of working with pipelines, with the tool chains, but there should have been awareness of what kind of best practice it promoted, it supported, so that you had some kind of guide, because what resulted there was that, the teams did just invent their own way of working, and, everyone started from scratch. And when you're dealing with a global organization with many, units there, that wastes a lot of time. So, how did we get through it? We focused on what worked, so we really loved that deployment model. That was a big change for us, being able to employ that kind of product thinking, to be able to deploy a product and work on a product and ensure its stability through all of the changes that went underneath it. The guardrails were very effective, when they weren't disabled. And there was a lot of standardisation benefits. I'm sure the penny pinchers were had their wallets swelling from not having to pay for our multiple CI/CD platforms. So we worked with the teams, and we decided that we weren't going to try and evangelize this platform. That just wouldn't work. But we weren't going to rip shreds off it either. So we decided we would start just acknowledging their issues. They're under a lot of pain, a lot of delivery pressure, and we didn't argue with the teams. And we helped them basically quantify the impact on delivery that they were facing, and we did that in two ways. So we consistently raised incidents and documented every degradation, remembering there is no observability yet. And we use that information to then quantify the impact on business terms. And that enabled us to go top down and bottom up. So we went top down to our stakeholders to say what this platform was doing to delivery, and we also went bottom up to all of the global, DevOps guilds, and anyone that would listen, and started interacting and meeting teams from other countries that were suffering the same kind of thing. And what we ended up doing was, creating a lot of evidence where none existed. We realised we couldn't fix the platform overnight, but what we tried to do was make the problem impossible to ignore. And we found the developers really started to engage with us then, even though their lives were a living nightmare with this platform. They worked with us. So, big insight here for me was that the tool chain wasn't just a platform, it was an interface to the architecture and the organisation underneath it. So the tools never failed, in isolation, but they worked. It's when they came together that there was a problem. The tool chain tooling, the templates, they did a lot of heavy lifting and they were awesome. The guardrails, they mostly worked. The real problem was the missing architecture glue, the lack of those foundational capabilities, observability, RBAC, test strategy, and environment consistency. Adding to that was obviously, as I've mentioned, the fragmented ownership model, the composable tech with non-composable teams, and the lack of an operating model supporting best practice, but also how those teams worked within the platform. So what would we do differently? So we'd design the whole system, not the tool chain. So obviously what had happened here was that the tool chain had just been spec'd, and people went and built it as it was on paper. So it's important to, and I saw a great slide from one of the other presenters earlier, and I think at the top it listed all of the elements of DevOps. It said QA, your culture, included op model there as well. So all of those elements go in to build a successful tool chain. We'd align the ownership to the architecture. So a composable platform needs that composable ownership. And third, we'd stop delivering foundational items later. So we'd have identified them at the start, really what needed to exist before we started to scale. And fourth, we'd define the best practice the platform supports. If the platform has tools that should be used in a certain way to support that best practice, then we need to publicise that. And finally, what we measure, we'd look at measuring reality, not intention. So SLAs on paper, they barely reflect the lived experience, so translate the impacts into business terms that people actually understand. So bringing it all together, again, the tool chain didn't really fail. What it did was expose deeper gaps in the architecture, the ownership, and the operating model behind it. And as adoption scaled, those gaps were amplified massively. So that for me is the clear reflection. If you zoom out a little bit and say, don't look at this as a tool chain or a pipeline or something, where your change has exposed deeper gaps because there are gaps in the architecture, the ownership, and the operating model behind it. It begs the question, where are we adding additional tooling complexity to be able to hide what lurks beneath? So I'll leave you with that. That's me. If there's any questions.